10 early signs of dementia you should never ignore. Forgetfulness, contrary to what most of us believe, is not an unavoidable part of getting older. Misplacing your keys or struggling to recall a name can be a normal part of everyday life, but some of the signals the brain sends out may actually be telling us something much bigger. This video is for general informational purposes only and is not a substitute for medical diagnosis or treatment advice. If you notice similar signs in yourself or in someone you love, please consult a healthcare professional. Some of the 10 signs we'll talk about today progress so quietly that even family members sharing the same home might not notice them for months, or sometimes even years. And around the middle of the list, we'll cover a sign that experts call the most overlooked, yet most meaningful one. This particular sign usually gets blamed on something completely different, which is exactly why it's one of the hardest to catch. So I'd recommend staying with us until the end, because this information could make a real difference in a loved one's life. The brain naturally slows down a bit as we age. Recalling a name might take a few extra seconds. Multitasking might feel a little more tiring. All of this is completely normal and shouldn't be a cause for concern on its own. But when we talk about dementia, we're not actually talking about a single disease. We're talking about a group of conditions that affect memory, thinking, language, reasoning, and the ability to carry out daily tasks. Alzheimer's disease is the most common of these and makes up a large portion of all dementia cases, but it isn't the only type. Other forms exist too, such as vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and frontotemporal dementia, and each one can show up with slightly different symptoms. Signs that are caught early can give a person and their family valuable time to plan ahead, seek expert support, get the right tests done, and take steps to preserve quality of life for as long as possible. In some cases, the underlying cause of these symptoms can be something that's completely treatable. That's why an early evaluation can both ease anxiety and help point the family toward the right kind of care. Now let's go through these 10 signs, one by one in order. Each one on its own might not be a major cause for concern, but seeing several of them together and noticing that they're becoming more frequent over time can be a good reason to talk with a specialist. An open conversation with your family doctor or a neurologist can often lift a lot of the uncertainty a family has been carrying. It's also worth adding this: dementia doesn't only affect memory. Different parts of the brain are responsible for different functions. Some manage memory, some manage language, and others manage spatial awareness and decision-making. Because of this, symptoms that show up in one person might never appear in another. For some people, the first noticeable change is memory-related. For others, the very first sign is a shift in personality or behavior. This variety is a big part of why families sometimes have such a hard time recognizing what's actually happening. Number 1, repeated forgetfulness that disrupts daily life. Everyone forgets things now and then. That's simply part of being human. But what we're talking about here is a repeating pattern. Things like asking the same question over and over within a short period of time, being almost unable to recall information that was just learned, or becoming increasingly dependent on notes and reminders just to keep track of important dates. Martha is a 68-year-old retired teacher. Her daughter noticed that her mother had asked about her grandson's birthday 3 separate times within the same week. At first, they chalked it up to tiredness and a busy month. But when the same thing happened again the following month, they decided to see a neurologist. This kind of forgetfulness can be linked to changes in the parts of the brain responsible for short-term memory, and catching it early can matter a great deal when it comes to getting the right guidance. Of course, stress, poor sleep, side effects from certain medications, or simply going through a demanding period in life can produce similar effects. That's why it's not a single incident that matters most, but a pattern that continues and becomes more noticeable over time. It can be very helpful for family members to keep a simple log of these repeated moments, since that information can be extremely useful during a conversation with a doctor. The nature of what's being forgotten matters too. For example, forgetting the name of a movie and then remembering it later is very different from insisting you never watched that movie in the first place. In that second example, it's not just that access to the information is affected. The way the information was stored to begin with may be affected. This is a subtle but important distinction that doctors pay close attention to when evaluating memory concerns. Number 2, difficulty with planning and problem solving. For some people, following a recipe step by step organizing monthly bills, or putting together a travel plan has always come naturally and even felt enjoyable. One of the early signs of dementia can be an unexpected slowdown or confusion with exactly these kinds of tasks. A person might struggle to work with numbers, might have trouble following steps in the correct order, or might take far longer than usual to finish something they used to complete with ease. This is different from simple forgetfulness. What's affected here is the ability to organize information, set priorities, and carry out steps in sequence. If someone who has managed the family budget without any trouble for years suddenly finds themselves completely lost, or if they keep making mistakes while following a simple recipe card they've used for decades, that can be an early signal worth paying attention to. Because these kinds of changes tend to progress slowly, family members often interpret them at first as simple distraction. But real difficulty following the order and logic of a task is a pattern worth noticing. In people who are still active in the workplace, this sign can also show up as trouble following along in meetings, making unusual mistakes while preparing reports, or increasingly asking coworkers for help with tasks that used to be routine. These kinds of changes can be noticed by the person experiencing them too, and that awareness often comes with feelings of anxiety and embarrassment. This is why the person may try to hide what's happening. Number 3, difficulty completing familiar tasks. Suddenly finding it hard to do something you've done for years without a second thought, cooking a favorite meal, finding your way home, or remembering the rules of a game you've played for decades is a notable change. Robert is 72 years old and has lived in the same neighborhood for 40 years. One day, he realized he had gotten lost on the way to the market he always goes to and struggled to find his way back home, even though he had walked that exact route thousands of times. This kind of confusion becomes especially significant when it happens more than once. When the brain starts to struggle even with tasks that have become almost automatic habitual routines, it can point to an underlying change, and getting a thorough evaluation at that point can be very helpful. In some people, this sign can show up on a smaller scale too, such as forgetting how to use a common kitchen appliance or struggling to operate a television remote. After this incident, Robert's family started going on walks with him and noticed something interesting. Some days the route felt completely familiar to him. Other days he'd pause with noticeable hesitation. This kind of fluctuation can be confusing for a lot of families because the good days can create the impression that everything is fine. But experts point out that early-stage symptoms often do follow this kind of up and down pattern. That's why performance that looks normal every once in a while doesn't necessarily mean there isn't a problem. Number 4, confusion with time and place. Temporarily mixing up the season, the time of day, or even your current location is another sign that can be linked to dementia. This goes beyond simply forgetting what day of the week it is. A person might feel lost even in a familiar place, or might lose track of the order in which events happened. For example, someone might have just eaten breakfast, but as evening approaches, they might believe it's time for breakfast again and try to start preparing a meal. Or they might get ready to visit a neighbor in the middle of the night. This kind of confusion around time is something families often notice, but tend to write off as just part of getting older. In reality, it's a sign that deserves closer attention. Some people may even lose track of where they are while driving through a neighborhood they know extremely well. This can be a frightening experience, both for the person and for their family. After an incident like this, some families are forced to have a conversation about safely taking away the car keys, and that conversation can be emotionally difficult since driving represents independence for so many people. Approaching this conversation without blame and framing safety as a shared priority can help make the discussion less tense for everyone involved. Number 5, changes in visual and spatial perception. For some people, the early signs of dementia have less to do with memory and more to do with vision and perception. Difficulty judging distances, trouble distinguishing color contrast, or miscalculating steps on a staircase are all examples. These changes are sometimes first noticed while driving. A person might have trouble figuring out exactly when to stop at an intersection or misjudge how far away an oncoming car actually is. In some cases, smaller but repeated signs can show up too, like misjudging the edge of a glass while pouring water or hesitating before stepping over a doorway because it looks like a shadow. Since vision problems can come from a lot of other causes as well, it makes sense to start by having an eye exam. But if these kinds of difficulties continue even after an eye exam comes back normal, a neurological evaluation may be worth considering. Some families notice that patterns in a rug or transitions between different types of flooring cause hesitation. A dark-colored doormat, for instance, can sometimes look to a person like a hole or a dip in the floor. These kinds of small adjustments around the home can be an easy first step toward making the space safer, and they usually don't come with a big cost. We've now covered the signs that tend to be the easiest to notice, since they're directly tied to memory and language. But the sign we're about to cover is one that experts pay especially close attention to because it's so often mistaken for a simple personality change or just written off as part of getting older. That's exactly why it can go unnoticed for months or even years. So I'd really encourage you to pay close attention to the next section. Number 6, struggling to find the right word while speaking or writing. Having a word on the tip of your tongue happens to everyone from time to time. But what may be linked to dementia is when this difficulty becomes more frequent and starts to noticeably disrupt the natural flow of conversation. A person might forget the names of simple, everyday objects, might pause mid-sentence and be unable to find the words to continue, or might start using long, roundabout phrases just to describe something simple. For example, someone who can't recall the word watch might instead describe it as that thing you wear on your wrist that tells you the time. A similar pattern can show up in writing too. Sentences might trail off unfinished, or the same word might get repeated several times. People around them often interpret these changes as simple distraction or tiredness at first. But over time, as the pattern becomes more noticeable, it can point to changes in the parts of the brain responsible for language and speech. Some people become aware of this difficulty themselves and start avoiding conversation altogether. They might keep phone calls short or choose to stay quiet in group settings. From the outside, this can look like someone simply becoming more withdrawn. But underneath it, there may be a real language difficulty at play. That's why looking into the underlying cause matters so much when it comes to providing the right kind of support. Number 7, placing items in unusual locations and being unable to retrace steps. Putting your keys in the refrigerator or leaving your glasses in the laundry basket isn't concerning on its own. Everyone gets distracted sometimes, and most people can remember and correct these little slips within a few minutes. But what may be linked to dementia is when a person has absolutely no memory of how an item ended up somewhere, and over time starts accusing others of being responsible. Dorothy is 75 years old, a retired nurse who spent many years in healthcare. After a while, things around the house started going missing on a regular basis, and Dorothy began to suspect that her husband or her caregiver was hiding her belongings. This suspicion eventually became so intense that her family wasn't sure how to handle it. This kind of behavioral change was both surprising and painful for her family, because Dorothy had always been known as someone calm, dependable, and level-headed. Her story is a good example of how these symptoms aren't only about memory. They can also become deeply intertwined with trust and close relationships. When situations like this come up, it can be genuinely important for the well-being of both the person and the family to stay calm rather than getting into an argument. Experts recommend that instead of trying to prove the person wrong, it's more helpful to gently search for the missing item together and redirect attention to something else. This approach can help prevent the person from feeling defensive or accused and can reduce day-to-day tension in the household. Number 8, decline in decision-making and judgments. Sudden and unusual changes in financial decisions. For example, someone who has always been extremely careful with money suddenly handing over a large sum to a stranger, or someone who starts neglecting their personal care in ways that are out of character, are areas that deserve attention. This sign can sometimes show up in the form of falling victim to a scam, since the ability to assess risk and feel appropriate suspicion may weaken over time. Family members often don't notice this kind of change until after a serious financial loss, or after the same thing happens more than once. In a similar way, wearing clothing that doesn't match the weather or no longer paying the same attention to personal hygiene can also fall into this category. So if you notice a sudden and unexplained shift in an older loved one's habits, it can be helpful to view it not as a single bad decision, but as part of a bigger picture that deserves a closer look. Some financial institutions and banks now offer systems that notify family members when unusual transactions are detected on an older adult's account. Looking into these kinds of protective measures ahead of time can help prevent significant financial losses down the road. Number 9, withdrawal from social and professional activities. Someone who once had an active social life, attended clubs, volunteered regularly, or kept up with hobbies on a consistent basis, gradually pulling away from all of that is a change that shouldn't be ignored. This withdrawal is sometimes mistaken for depression, and in fact, the two can occur together, which makes it that much harder to tell them apart. But when withdrawal is linked to dementia, it's often because the person feels overwhelmed in complex social situations, struggles to follow along in conversation, or pulls back out of fear of making mistakes. James is 70 years old and had played chess with the same group of friends every week for years. Over the past several months, he started mixing up basic rules of the game, felt embarrassed about it, and began turning down invitations from his friends one after another. At first, his family assumed this was just becoming more withdrawn with age or a dip in mood, but underneath it was actually a cognitive difficulty. When family members notice this kind of withdrawal, gently asking why without blame or pressure can be an important first step toward getting the right kind of help. Instead of confronting James directly, his family started inviting him to smaller gatherings with fewer people. This made James feel more comfortable, and over time, he became willing to rejoin social settings again. His story is a good example of how small adjustments to the environment can go a long way in helping someone hold on to their social connections. Number 10, noticeable changes in mood, personality, and behavior. The last sign on our list may be the most overlooked of all because it's often summed up with a simple phrase, they're just not themselves anymore. And this shift usually happens slowly, almost too gradually to notice at first. Personality changes linked to dementia can show up as increased anxiety, suspicion, restlessness, or unexpected outbursts of anger. A once calm person might suddenly become impatient. Someone outgoing might become withdrawn. A person who is always flexible might become rigid and stubborn. These changes can be especially hard on the people around them because they sense that someone they love has changed, but they can't immediately understand why, and they sometimes experience it as a personal hurt. This is exactly the point where patience matters most, and where it helps to see these changes not as a personal insult, but as a possible sign of an underlying health issue. Families dealing with this kind of change often end up neglecting their own emotional needs. But it's important for caregivers to get support too, both for their own well-being and for the quality of care they're able to provide to the person they love. Local support groups and counseling services can offer families an important source of strength throughout this process. Now, if you've made it this far and you've noticed a few of these 10 signs in yourself or in someone close to you, I'd encourage you not to panic right away. Many of these symptoms can also come from conditions that are entirely treatable. Things like a vitamin B12 deficiency, thyroid issues, sleep apnea, chronic stress, or side effects from certain medications. That's why getting an early evaluation doesn't just help investigate the possibility of dementia. It can also uncover other treatable causes, and in some cases, it can lead to symptoms improving significantly. Telling the difference between early-stage dementia and normal aging is one of the hardest things for families to navigate. As a general rule, forgetting something and then later recalling it without it seriously disrupting daily life tends to be more consistent with normal aging. On the other hand, information that's completely lost, the same pattern repeating over and over and daily functioning becoming progressively more affected, is a picture that deserves closer evaluation. Making that distinction is, of course, a job for a doctor. But a family's observations are one of the most valuable parts of that process. During an evaluation, doctors typically take a detailed history, run a variety of cognitive tests, order blood work, and sometimes turn to brain imaging. This process can feel intimidating at first, but the real goal is to give the person a clear path forward and remove unnecessary uncertainty. Many families find that by the end of this evaluation process, they end up with a much clearer and more actionable picture than they expected, and that in itself can bring a real sense of relief for both the person and their family. Research shows that a significant portion of the population worldwide over the age of 65 is living with some form of dementia, and that this proportion rises noticeably with age. This is exactly why early recognition and getting the right kind of support matter so much. There's also a growing body of scientific interest in how general lifestyle factors, Regular physical activity, staying socially connected, eating a balanced diet, and keeping chronic health conditions under control may help support cognitive health. That said, for guidance tailored to your specific situation, it's essential to consult a healthcare professional. It's also thought that regularly monitoring general health markers like blood pressure, cholesterol, and blood sugar levels may indirectly support brain health through their effects on heart and blood vessel health. Research in this area is still ongoing, and clearer answers are expected to emerge over time. If you've noticed some of the signs described in this video, either in yourself or in someone you love, talking to a family doctor or a neurologist can be a great first step. Remember, seeking an early evaluation doesn't mean receiving a definite diagnosis. It simply helps you take a more informed, more prepared, and more supportive approach going forward. Family members showing patience with one another throughout this process may be just as valuable as medical treatment itself. What do you think families could do to recognize these signs earlier? Share your own experiences or observations with us in the comments. Reading your stories could be genuinely valuable for other families going through a similar journey. If you found this video helpful, please remember to like it and share it with someone you care about. And if you'd like to keep seeing trustworthy, clear, and balanced content on health topics like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel.